Thank you for inviting me, Amanda and youth. I loved my 15 years in Placerville and all the activities at Federated Church. Some of you may remember me, Pastor Bob. I was retired at that point. I want to tell you something about my experience in the South marching with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I had met him while I was still in college, and he had just finished the Montgomery bus boycott, which gave African American citizens the right to sit wherever they wanted to sit in the buses of the city of Montgomery. He decided that the next most important thing to address nationwide was voter rights. Throughout the South, especially in Alabama and Mississippi, Black Americans were prevented, discouraged, found it nearly impossible to register to vote. The states required a poll tax. You had to pay if you were Black. And they devised a test which nobody could pass, and it was only administered to Black American citizens. In the county, next to the county where Selma is the county seat, Lowndes County, the officials, the white officials in the courthouse, which is where you had to go to register to vote, erected a gallows. You're familiar with that word? A scaffold from which they hung a noose. Lynching was not yet forbidden by law. So if a Black American showed up in Lowndes County to register to vote, the official would simply point a finger at that noose. It's pretty discouraging. The threats were very real. The obstacles were very real. In the county where Selma was the county seat, only 2% of the Black citizens were registered to vote, which meant that everything was run by white people. So Martin Luther King chose the city of Selma to become sort of a symbol that all of America could look at and learn about and figure out what was going on. And as in most cases, if Black citizens staged a demonstration or a march, they marched to the courthouse, and they'd already helped maybe 3 or 4 people figure out how to fill out the forms, how to actually do that. The officials would simply lock the courthouse doors. And so Dr. King led citizens in this manner to the courthouse in Selma, and the doors were locked. And he tried again, and the doors were locked. So he said, all right, we're gonna march all the way to Montgomery, which is the capital of the state of Alabama. It's about 50 miles away. And to get out of Selma, you have to cross a bridge, the Edmund Pettus Memorial Bridge. And when this group of Black Americans, led by Dr. Martin Luther King, tried to cross the bridge, they were met by a group of armed sheriffs on horseback. The only thing you had to do to be a sheriff in Alabama at that time, or in that county, was you appeared before the elected sheriff and he pinned a badge on you. You were a sheriff for the afternoon. So these people in riot gear, these white people on horseback with heavy truncheons, police truncheons, attacked the group led by Dr. King across the bridge, injured several very seriously. John Lewis, who died just recently, suffered a fractured skull. They ran back for safety to the Browns Memorial African Methodist Episcopal Church. And Dr. King said, all right, in 2 weeks we're going to try this again. And he said that he'd like some support from white people who felt that this was an injustice. And the second march was turned back more peacefully. The marchers, led by Dr. King, knelt on the bridge, they prayed, and then they turned and walked peacefully back to the church. And 2 of the white ministers who had come from Boston to support Dr. King and the marchers, the people who wanted to vote, to register to vote. They felt safe. Selma was very segregated. All the black people lived in what were called the projects, which were high-rise tenements in one section of town. They couldn't buy a house anywhere else, even if they had jobs and had a salary. So anyway, these two white ministers, the evening of that second attempted march, went downtown to eat at a restaurant. And when they came out of the restaurant, they were attacked from behind by, we don't know how many men because nobody was ever prosecuted for it, by some white men with metal pipes who beat them with the metal pipes. James Reeb was taken to the hospital where he died. So Martin Luther King put out a call for more people to come and support. And I decided, okay, it's my time. And within 24 hours of Reverend Reeb's death, I arrived in Selma, having flown overnight from the Bay Area to Atlanta and then taken a puddle jumper to Montgomery, not knowing how I would get from there to Selma or where I would sleep. There were some Catholic priests who had a big van, and they were just picking up people like me. I was pretty conspicuous. I was wearing a clerical collar, just announcing that I was a minister, and carrying a sleeping bag. That's all I took with me. And they drove me and some others to Selma, to the projects, where there were black families, black people who lived in the tenements who were willing to allow us to sleep on their floor. So this woman, middle-aged, still had some kids at home, took me up in the elevator and said, all right, you can roll out your sleeping bag here. And I said, well, I want to call my wife and family and tell them that I'm safe and that I've arrived. And she said, please don't do that. She said, all of our phones are tapped. And you can go home, but this is my home. I can't leave. And I'll lose my job. Well, that afternoon, the police took down the obstacles they had set up to keep marchers from coming to the courthouse, and we marched behind Dr. King to the courthouse. There were a few of us who were white. It was mostly black teenagers. And we stood outside the locked courthouse, and Martin Luther King gave a speech. Some other very famous people gave speeches. And they asked us who were white and who had clerical collars, who were ministers, to stand on the outside around the black teenagers. So we would get attacked first if we were attacked. And a large white mob gathered around us, so close, since I was in the back row, that I could feel their breath. I was spit on. I heard somebody whisper in my ear, we got Reverend Reeb last night. We'll find you. Very direct threats. And so what did we do? The group of marchers, we sang. We sang hymns, and we sang We Shall Overcome. And singing We Shall Overcome under those circumstances is not like singing in church. What an experience that was, to gain the power of what faith and action was capable of doing, and seeing the bravery of these teenagers who were willing to stand there and take the threats. So I stayed for 10 days, and we didn't know if there was going to be another march, but there were more people wanting another march. I mean, from all over the country. And so I helped with various organizational details as we tried to figure out how many toilets do you need if 10,000 people are marching out through the fields where there's no place to stop. And on the Sunday of the march from Selma to Montgomery, everybody, some estimates were 10,000 people. The President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, had introduced a voter rights bill to the National Congress. At the end of his speech to Congress, he said, "We shall overcome." It was amazing to be in an almost entirely black neighborhood where everybody was standing outside listening to the radios, which they had loudspeakers up in the trees, to hear the President of the United States recite those words. It was a sea change. The morning of the march is, lining up 10,000 people. We were in rows of 8. I have no idea if I was in the middle or toward the end. There was a lot of people. We filled most of the streets of the city. And in rows of 8, there was a white minister on one end, and a white minister, in this case me, was on the other end, and the 6 people in between were black teenagers from Selma. The idea was that if the march was attacked, we would take the first blows. We'd been trained in nonviolence, how to fall to the ground and try to protect our head. They could break everything else, but hopefully they wouldn't break our head. The march that day went off remarkably smoothly. Only 300 people of the 10,000 were going to take the next 3 days through Lowndes County, where they had the gallows next to the desk where you registered to vote. And then the whole group of however many would regather in Montgomery at the end. So I marched out of Selma across the bridge. Nobody tried to stop us that time. People were lined up, white crowds all along. I mean, where I was marching was maybe 3 or 4 feet from people who were shouting insults and threats at us, occasionally trying to spit on us. It made me sick to my stomach on January 6th this year to see some of those same people storming our Capitol. Racism is never going to be eradicated. It's important to remember that. And America stands for giving everybody certain rights, responsibilities, and privileges, and the right to vote is absolutely basic. So if I have one piece of advice for you who are not yet 18, when you are 18, please register to vote. People have given their lives to give you and everybody that right and that privilege. And one of our political parties, the Republican Party, is doing their best at this point to make it as hard as possible for poor people to vote. They don't want them voting. They set up very few polling places where the majority of the people are black citizens. Just remember, you have a privilege to be a voter. Be aware that when we do the right thing, as Martin Luther King said, it's always the right time to do the right thing. Because people kept telling me, oh, it's not the right time. You've got to stop. You've got to pare this down. He said, it's always the right time to do the right thing. So thank you for hearing me. I appreciate the privilege to relate that part of American history in which I was privileged to play a small part.